Hello everyone, welcome to Retro Dad and Modern Lad, the YouTube channel and soon to be website. Over the years, the Sega Saturn community has been very lucky to have been given access to many previously unreleased games. Some of these are very early prototype demos such as Colliders, shown in the video, which only allow for a glimpse into what a game could have been before its cancellation. Whilst other games such as The Last Dynasty are almost fully complete games coming on multi-discs. Having access to these unreleased games can also allow us to get a better understanding of the Saturn's history, such as the recently released The Sakura Pools, turning out to be the same game as Rebellion. Having both available online allowed the link to be made that they were the same game, although looking back I should have noticed before. Despite many unreleased games now being available online, today we're going to look at games that are not available. These are often in the hands of collectors or ex-developers. Fak Down is an action-adventure game with elements of survival horror. The video, available from MadRuns, is very early into development, as demonstrated by the characters and enemies floating about. The game had a lot of potential and seems to be a mix of games such as Die Hard Arcade, Resident Evil and Deep Fear in terms of gameplay. The environments are pre-rendered backgrounds and enemies such as mutant monsters appear to promote survival horror, but the combat system is more action orientated, with the ability to kick, punch and do combos. Interestingly, the game was being designed by Katsuhiro Otomo of Akira manga fame. In the game you take the role of the young hero fighting against the fakers who are trying to take over. The game was featured in many magazines and was listed as being between 50 and 60% complete, although it's not known how much further the game got on development before it was cancelled. Next up we have Destruction Derby 2, which you can see video footage from Sega Saturn UK. Probe was handling the port to Sega Saturn of Destruction Derby 2, and the original Destruction Derby was released for the Sega Saturn in Europe and Japan, although the US version was cancelled. Unfortunately, the original Destruction Derby port to Sega Saturn was of poor quality and suffered from issues such as considerable slowdown, reduced draw distance and poor textures compared to the PlayStation version. The video footage available of Destruction Derby 2 Sega Saturn is at an early stage. There is only one track and no computer opponents on the track. Furthermore, the car and track are not fully rendered and sound effects are limited. The build shown in the video comes on 2 discs, with the menus on disc 1 and the playable track on disc 2. In a twist of events, there is a comment on the video claiming to be from a developer of the game, and he claims the game was actually 95% complete before it was cancelled. Now it's difficult to say if this is true, so take it with a pinch of salt, but if it is, there is also a chance there's a much further version of the game out there. X2, also known as Project X2, is a 2D shoot 'em up that could be played in 1 or 2 player. It is the sequel to the Amiga game called Project X and was a collaboration between Team 17 and Ocean, who also did Worms together. The game was in development for the Sega Saturn and a promotional video was released with Sega Saturn Video Magazine in Japan. The video being shown was uploaded by MrRetroGreg on YouTube. The game did end up coming out for the PlayStation to fairly average reviews, although at the time many 2D games were not receiving favourable reviews on the PlayStation. The game was criticised for being too hard but praised for great boss fights and awesome music. More recently, the game has become a bit of a cult favourite and is more appreciated. While it would not challenge games like Radiant Silvergun or Sokyuga Rintai for the Sega Saturn's best shoot 'em up, it would be a welcome addition to the Saturn library if it ever surfaces. The game was heavily featured in Japanese Sega Saturn magazines, and it was suggested it was 95% complete at the time of this article. It also featured in a small section of Sega Saturn UK magazine. Prize Fighter is an FMV boxing game released for the Sega CD, and a Sega Saturn port was also being developed. This video by Darkwater298 shows the unreleased Sega Saturn version being played at the Portland Expo 2015. At first, this was the only known Sega Saturn version. Unfortunately, it was damaged and had a hole in the data layer section of Disc 1, while Disc 2 was missing. This damage was unfortunate and demonstrates the importance of backing games up for preservation. Thankfully, in 2022, this video was uploaded by trmchenry, which showed the unreleased game prototype fully playable and recovered from the original build files. When Prize Fighter was originally released for the Sega CD, FMV games were all the rage due to their realism, although that didn't last long and they quickly went out of fashion. The YouTube channel features videos from both the English and Japanese versions uploaded, but as of this video, the game is not being released. At one stage it was announced by magazines that Namco would be porting its PlayStation games to the Sega Saturn, starting with an improved version of Cyber Sled. However, Namco ended up signing a deal with Sony and didn't release any new games for the Sega Saturn. However, in 2019, on a post in Assembler Games, a user showcased they had 16 discs with different builds for Cyber Sled Saturn. The owner was able to get the discs to boot with help from the community and released some images of the game being played on a Sega Saturn emulator. Rensa is an unreleased puzzle game for the Sega Saturn and the first of two games on this list that is owned by the same Japanese collector. They first showed off the game on their Twitter account. The game can apparently be completed and looks a fairly average puzzle game. The owner has since allowed the YouTube channel Back Alley's Gamers to record multiple videos of the game being played in high quality, as can be seen in the video. The Sega Saturn does have quite a lot of similar puzzle games, but it would still be great to see this one released in the future. At first, not a lot was known about this game, but it was first called Faradoon: The Legend of Dragon Castle before changing its name to Monica Noshiro. This is a game that I've featured on the channel before, and it's one I've wanted to see released for a long time. This video came from a Sega Saturn promotional VHS video from Japan, and the game is reported to have been in playable form at the 1997 Tokyo Game Show, although that's not confirmed. The game also had final box art produced, and there was various adverts placed in Japanese Sega Saturn magazines. Out of nowhere, the game reappeared in April 2021 and is the second game shown off on the Twitter account of @Zan2ZanJP. Similar to Rensa, the YouTube channel Back Alley's Gamers have been allowed to record high quality footage and have a full playthrough on their channel. While not the release we all wanted, it's still great to be able to finally see this game in all its glory. The game was a 3D action RPG which had impressive graphical style for the Sega Saturn. The video shows you could play as 4 different characters and change into forms of animals, perform magic, collect items, fight a variety of enemies and bosses, solve puzzles and visit multiple locations. On closer inspection you can see that there's a timer bar when you transform in the bottom left of the screen, which when it runs out you transform back into the main character. Different forms shown include a bird that can fly over danger and a wolf who can blast through walls. It's also impressive that it doesn't seem to have to load constantly when going from room to room. This is such an interesting game, and it's rare that Japanese collectors reveal what games they've got in their possession. In my opinion, it's likely a lot of unreleased games for the Sega Saturn are in the hands of Japanese collectors and also ex-developers. Usually we know of unreleased games when they're in the hands of people from Europe or America, even if they're not released.
Millennium Fire
is a light gun game for the Sega Saturn by Bandai. It was heavily featured in magazines and has appeared in multiple videos on Japanese demo discs. They include Flash Sega Saturn Volume 32 and an interview playthrough by the developer on Mogatate Demo 4. The game had a very unique game-playing style and was played using the Sega Saturn Stunner light gun. However, unlike other shooting games, it wasn't on the rails and the player had control of movement. This was achieved by using a combination of on-screen indicators called guidelines and also by incorporating the start button on the Sega Saturn Stunner to assist with being able to move in any direction freely. The game would have had a strong element of adventure and survival horror, as well as being a light gun game. For example, the player isn't alone in the game and has other team members who can help you or may need assistance. Another aspect of the game that would have helped to increase longevity was that depending on how you performed in certain situations, the story would change based on your actions. The official Sega Saturn magazine UK highlighted Millennium Fire as the game of the show for the Tokyo Game Show 1998 and were very impressed with what they had seen. Although from reading the article in the official Sega Saturn UK magazine, it's difficult to tell whether it was in video form or it was in fact playable form at the Tokyo Game Show 1998. However, after further research, I found a magazine in Japan that had a picture of Millennium Fire, and it was clear that it was being played at the Tokyo Game Show, so there was a demo available. This makes it even more likely that there's a version out there, even if it's in demo form. The game was scheduled for release in around August 1998 but was cancelled mere weeks before release. It seems very likely there's a near finished version of Millennium Fire out there somewhere, if not finished, and there should also be a demo disc from the Tokyo Game Show 98. With using a light gun, this one would require the use of a CRT TV to get the best out of it. And despite the Saturn already having the excellent ports of Virtua Cop 1 and 2, and the very fun but shoddy House of the Dead port, this game would bring something totally new to the Saturn, and it's one I'd love to play. Shemu was in development for the Sega Saturn before moving over to the Dreamcast. Not a lot was known about Shemu to Sega Saturn until by completing Shemu 2 on the Dreamcast, you could unlock a video showcasing the game. The game was originally going under the name Virtua Fighter RPG for the Sega Saturn, before it was decided it would be its own franchise. The Shemu characters still have a striking resemblance to the Virtua Fighter characters in the finished game. For example, Ryo, the main character, has a striking resemblance to Akira from Virtua Fighter. Meanwhile, the villain of the game, Lan Di, also looks similar to Lao Chan from Virtua Fighter. If you're familiar with the characters from Virtua Fighter and their fighting styles, you'll notice other similarities between the characters from both games. The game looks visually stunning for a Sega Saturn game and would have rocked the entire community had it been released, with the game in development for the Sega Saturn for approximately 2 years and being around 60% complete when it moved over to the Dreamcast. Whilst the video is mainly cutscenes, if you watch carefully there are clearly a few short clips of the game being played. Now it must be stated that these are bare bones corridor sections or straight forest walking, but most of the story and graphics appear to be implemented in the Saturn version. Watching the video, you can see that the story was implemented from Shemu 1 and 2 for the Sega Saturn version, as video footage shows cutscenes from the beginning of Shemu 1 and also very close to the end of Shemu 2. This doesn't necessarily mean the whole game was fully playable, rather just the cutscenes and story were most likely complete. Also noticeable is that the voice audio for the characters had not yet been implemented on the Saturn version. Some noticeable differences between the Saturn version and the Dreamcast release are reduced polygon count. Ryo is wearing just a plain white t-shirt and no jacket, and also a simpler scene showing Ryo saving the animal from Shemu 2. It would be really interesting to see more footage of Saturn Shemu released so we could compare the story and how it was in the early builds compared to the finished Dreamcast versions. I would imagine there's a lot of changes being made along the way, and it probably would have needed optimization for real hardware. The frame rate dips particularly low in the forest playable running section you see in the video. In my opinion, Saturn Shemu is one of a number of games that were cancelled for the Saturn, but could have showcased the system had another gear with the ability to produce even higher quality games. Unfortunately, the life cycle of the Sega Saturn was so short that we never got to see the next level of games. In more recent years, Yu Suzuki and other people who worked on Shemu have given some more information. This included at the Game Developers Conference in 2014, when a timeline that started with the pre-Shemu Old Man and the Peach Tree prototype for Saturn and went all the way through to the Dreamcast release. Also at GDC 2014, when talking about Shemu Saturn, the developers said the quality was impressive and it performed pretty well for Saturn. Furthermore, Yu Suzuki confirmed it went as far as Guilin. There is hope we will get more information soon, as lead programmer Tak Hirai did tweet in October 2022 about Shemu Saturn, including revealing the statute of limitations should have expired by now. Virtua Fighter 3 creator Yu Suzuki announced that the game was in development for the Sega Saturn at the Power Up press conference in November 1996. He was quoted as saying, "The question was, can we actually do it? But after the results attained from studying the matter for 3 months, we have concluded that technically the possibility is there. Department AM2 and I have the responsibility of making this possible, so please expect the best." The Sega Saturn had already received a very good but flawed port of Virtua Fighter 1 and an excellent port of Virtua Fighter 2, which ran at an ultra smooth 60 frames per second and was that much of an improvement over the first port. It looked like it was running on a different console generation. After the initial announcement that Virtua Fighter 3 was coming to the Sega Saturn, news was few and far between. A trailer was released in Japan for the Saturn version of the game that you can see now, but showed no actual gameplay. Multiple magazines reported that Sega was looking into releasing a 3D graphics accelerator cartridge. This would assist by boosting the Saturn's power to help run the graphically intense Model 3 arcade games. It was suggested that Lockheed Martin were developing the Sega Saturn graphics accelerator cartridge for Sega. It was then reported again in magazines that the idea for the graphics accelerator cartridge had been abandoned, most likely due to the high costs. With Sega announcing the Sega Dreamcast was on its way, speculation mounted about which console Virtua Fighter 3 would come out for. Japanese magazine Saturn Fan claimed Sega had basic versions of both Saturn and Dreamcast Virtua Fighter 3 up and running, but hadn't decided which to release. After no official information had been given about Virtua Fighter 3 Saturn since its announcement, its fate was sealed in September 1998. Sega announced that Virtua Fighter 3 would be coming to Dreamcast, and the Sega Saturn version had been cancelled. No pictures or video was ever released of Virtua Fighter 3 Saturn running, but at one point fake pictures did circulate on the internet but were later debunked as the arcade game running on an emulator. At the same press conference, Yu Suzuki announced Virtua Fighter 3 as coming to Sega Saturn. He also had this to say when speaking about Digital Dance Mix, according to Saturn Fan. If you look at this software, I think you get a little idea of how Virtua Fighter 3 will be ported to Saturn. Yu Suzuki produced Digital Dance Mix, and it features a high-res model with moving clothes and hair, which all featured in Virtua Fighter 3. It looks very impressive for the Sega Saturn. Although the backgrounds and stage were pretty basic in Digital Dance Mix, and I think this is where the challenge would have came for Virtua Fighter 3 Sega Saturn. Despite being an excellent port, Virtua Fighter 2 also had to make some changes when coming from arcade to Saturn when it came to stage design and background, and this would have been even more challenging for Virtua Fighter 3. However, since Virtua Fighter 2 came out on Sega Saturn, games such as Virtua Fighter Kids had more impressive backgrounds. Despite this game not being as good as Virtua Fighter 2, mainly due to the short reach of the characters, it is often overlooked that graphically this game looks brilliant for the Sega Saturn. The biggest indication of what the game may have looked like is Fighters Megamix on Sega Saturn. Both this and Virtua Fighter 3 have the same desert stage, and Fighters Megamix also features the Virtua Fighter characters' moves from Virtua Fighter 3. Some noticeable differences include, on Saturn the sun is further away, there is no blowing sand, and the desert floor is flat as opposed to being multi-layered on the Dreamcast. These are likely compromises that could have been made to get the game running on Saturn in other levels as well. Whilst the excellent stages and backgrounds in Last Bronx Saturn had shown the Saturn was capable of doing highly detailed 3D style stages, here are two similarly designed underground train stages. On Saturn Virtua Fighter 3, they could have reduced the steps to 2 instead of 4 and removed the train as small changes to get it running on the system, I think. One popular theory I often see is that people think Virtua Fighter 3 became Fighters Megamix. However, this is not possible because they were both announced as coming to Saturn at the same Power Up press conference in 1996. And while Virtua Fighter 3 Saturn was beginning development, Fighters Megamix was going to be released in 2 months' time in Japan. Here you can see some other graphically impressive stages from Last Bronx Saturn. There are a lot of rumours online about Virtua Fighter 3 Saturn, but most of them are unsubstantiated. Interestingly, when Sega announced that Virtua Fighter 3 will be coming to Dreamcast and the Sega Saturn version had been cancelled, multiple magazines quoted Sega PR as saying the following: "We have been working on development of Virtua Fighter 3 at the same time. We judge it would be difficult to achieve the quality level that would satisfy our customers, so we decided to discontinue development and release of the product. To all fans who have been waiting for the Sega Saturn version to be completed, we are very sorry." From this information we can estimate the game was being worked on for around a year and a half. There's no doubt the Saturn version would have had to make compromises and would not have been able to achieve the level of port Dreamcast could. I also think Sega most likely thought having the popular Virtua Fighter 3 as a Dreamcast exclusive would help sell more consoles, and bringing it out on the still popular in Japan Sega Saturn would affect sales of the Dreamcast game. Another challenge for the Sega Saturn version would have been the new character Taka. He is a lot larger than the other characters, and this could potentially have caused difficulty in being able to maintain a high frame rate on more detailed stages with less powerful hardware. Another important aspect is the Saturn version of Virtua Fighter 3 was being handled by the original team, AM2 and Yu Suzuki, whereas the Dreamcast port was being handled by Genki. More recently, in a Shemu 3 interview by Eurogamer, as the last question, the interviewer asked Yu Suzuki what he remembers about Virtua Fighter 3 Saturn. Yu Suzuki responded by leaning back in his chair, closing his eyes for a second before responding with a simple "No, I don't." He sat back up and continued, "I honestly don't remember. I'm the type of guy that jumps into new projects 100%, and that was a long time ago, so I really don't remember anything about it." This was a strange answer when you consider he announced the game and worked on it for so long. He almost certainly does remember, but didn't want to talk about it. It's not just Yu Suzuki who doesn't want to talk about it. No one who worked on the game or at Sega has ever wanted to talk about it. The secrecy just adds to the intrigue about the game for fans who are still desperate all these years later to get some more information. If you've liked this video, please give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We mainly cover Sega Saturn. Also, let me know in the comments which unreleased games you were most disappointed never came out, and which ones you hope to see in the future. Thanks for watching.